You are listening to the People Centric Podcast, where we talk through the toughest challenges that people face at work and give practical advice to fixing those challenges. Thanks for joining our movement to create workplaces that are happier, healthier, aligned, and empowered by putting people at the center of all that we do.
Hey, people-centric leaders. Welcome to the People-Centric Podcast this week. I'm gonna start off with a little bit of a story. Everybody loves my stories. That's what we keep hearing from my mom, who calls me and says, like, I like your stories. That's awesome. So we appreciate my mom for listening. And actually, truth be told, I'm pretty sure my mom doesn't know how to access a podcast. So that'll be fun.
Well, you should show her. She'd be really proud of you.
She why did you say it like that? She would be really proud of, like, the podcast puts me over the top.
No,
Yeah.
it's just another point of pride. Like you should show her. She would be proud of you for
I'll show
doing
her.
this.
Yeah. And then it'd be like talking to you every week, you know?
Yeah. And her whole team.
Yeah. Oh, this is kind of sweet. Now I want your mom to listen to it.
Wow. No.
I'll say hi to her. Hi, John's
Okay.
mom.
Okay, mom, everyone wants to say hi to you on this
We
episode.
appreciate
This is the
you.
episode. Yeah. So here's the story real quick. So a lot of you know I'm a recovering engineer. I started my first 10 years of my career as an engineer. I was a chemical engineer, a couple big companies, 3M and Archer Daniels Midland. And one of those companies had a safety incident that occurred. And nobody got hurt, but somebody almost could have got hurt, is what happened. And so we were looking into it, and there was a group that was assigned, as often happens when there's what's called a near miss. There's a group of engineers that are assigned to look into it to find out exactly what caused it so that you can eliminate the cause so you can prevent that from happening again. And what it did was something that happened to a pump. I'll just be generic on that. That's not important exactly what happened, but this pump almost exploded. So we were worried about that. So what caused the pump to almost explode? And we had two very different theories out that were proposed by the team. And we were debating the two theories that were out there. And one side was taking, well, I think it's this, this, and this. Another side was saying, I would think it's this, this, and this. And our safety manager at the time was starting to see a lot of conflict in the room and a lot of disagreement, and it was making him really uncomfortable. And so he said something really odd, as he said, well, maybe you're both right. Maybe both the cause is both things that actually happened, which is literally like technically impossible. It was actually not even possible for both of those two things to happen that are out there. And so the reason I tell that story is, first of all, like the whole room kind of paused, like went like, no, actually it can't be. There was a little bit of a discussion amongst the engineers. Like, we all knew each other and had been working together for a long time. And so while we were speaking passionately about the different theories that were out there, as soon as he said that, we all kind of went like, no, we're all cool. We're just disagreeing with each other right now. We're going to try to find the solution, and we'll try to figure out which thing really actually happened. I was right, by the way, not trying to keep score, but I was right about what actually happened. But that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is, how do we disagree at work? We've started to notice more and more, especially since the pandemic, that a lot of teams are forgetting how to people, as Stephanie said earlier today. Like, sometimes you just forget how to people. How do we disagree with each other at work and still create a team? Is disagreement something that's a threat to the team? Is it a threat to harmony? Is it something that can tear a team apart? Or is it something that could bring a team closer together? So that's going to be the topic for today. Hint, hint, it's the latter. I don't want to cut to the end. You can just skip the rest of the podcast. Okay, no, we can't. They're all shaking their head. We cannot
Don't skip the rest of the podcast. There's good stuff here. We're gonna do the whole thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I just thought we could save.
Don's mom is listening, so we've got to do this.
I thought we could just save some time and just say, yes, it's okay to disagree at work. Any questions?
That's not how we can do that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing with you right now.
Diana is disagreeing with me, which I have learned is dangerous. So Diana, what's the worst disagreement you and I have ever had?
Oh my God, no, no.
This one right now.
The worst disagreement.
Or what's an example of a disagreement you and I have had? We don't have to say like the worst disagreement
Okay.
we've ever had.
Well, the worst, I'm gonna say the worst one. I'm just gonna throw it out there. It was when we were traveling to
Kansas City.
Was it Kansas City or Oklahoma City?
See, you don't even know, which is part of the disagreement. Go ahead.
I don't even know where we were going.
Story,
Doesn't matter. But he kept saying, "What are the directions?" And I was like, "Just listen to Siri. She's going to tell you the next time you need to move." And he'd be like, "No, I need you to tell me." And I was like, "I'm not going to tell you because I am terrible at this. That's why we have the technology that the thing will tell you. Like, she's going to say it out loud. I don't have to."
Yeah. This is before I
You
had the
should
car
say
that
it in advance too. Like it's not like she's supposed to say it
Exactly.
in advance.
She did say it in advance. So, but he wanted me to say what she was going to say before she said it. It was
I was on a
ridiculous.
5-lane interstate and I wanted to know if I was going to be getting off in 6 miles or in six feet.
Well, we disagreed hard about how that should happen.
It was awful. Yeah. Well,
That was
I
our
hated
worst
for you,
fight to date.
Diana. I am sorry that you could not look down at the device sitting on your lap in the car at the moment and tell me what it said.
I just didn't understand what the point of that would be.
Clearly. And this happened probably what, 8 years ago,
Oh,
7 years ago, something like that.
you're still in the old office. It's been
It's been
9 years. Yeah.
9 years. So at least we're over it now, right? Yeah.
At least the worst fight we've ever had was 9 years ago. It could have gotten way worse since then, and
Yeah.
it didn't. So that's
Okay. Well, there's Diana. So whatever I say, you'll hear Diana say it probably opposite. So that's great. So
not true.
yeah. Well, no, it's true. It's true. It's true.
Not true.
Um, I'm gonna go to Philip next. Philip's with us here. Philip's been a little bit quiet, or we've talked over him a couple times here. Philip, you're a very positive person. Do you have disagreements with people at work?
I am a very disagreeable person. You should, yeah, no, no. Everywhere I've worked, when I worked, really anywhere I've worked, people have been like, "You're just like sunshine," and I appreciate that. But when it's time, I don't like conflict, and so I think for me, I have a whole internal process. If I'm going to be the initiator to bridge a conflict, I have lots of things I do to prepare for that. And for me, it's always the conversation of it's just as simple as a countdown. I'll count down from 10 right before you actually make the call to schedule an appointment or to go in person. Like I just have to count down. And then you're like, okay, we're going to go for it. And it usually works out well. But on a recent road trip to Colorado, we were talking with some friends and this subject came up. And, driving from Springfield to Denver, you're driving through Kansas. So what could get worse? And we just started talking about all the conflicts. We've not had a friend group of us in the car, just like our own experiences, separate but in previous life. And they were like, "How many conflicts have you had?" I started naming them. There have been a few, like really crucial conversations that I initiated, whether it's like with peers or with leaders. And I think for me, my tendency, I tend to not like bridge those until I'm like, there's more value by bridging it than not, right? Like I don't just bring it up all the time. But that's my approach. So I probably could continue growing in that too. But when it's worth it, it's worth it. So you got to do your countdown and then jump into it and have a good conversation.
I like that, Philip. And one time you told me something I think it's really important is you said, while you're a positive person, positivity doesn't mean that you always feel positive about everything.
Yeah. Yes, that is true.
So while you might see somebody on your team like, oh, they never have a conflict. They may actually be disagreeing with you and they may be working towards figuring out how to bring that up. Especially if you see them counting down. Apparently that's the moment.
Yeah. If you see me talking to myself with numbers,
Yeah. Yeah.
buckle up. No.
That's when I run, right? Because I'm like, Philip's about to explode.
Yeah, that's right. 7, 6.
Here it comes. Here it comes. Yeah. So Stephanie, you're more of like I'm going to take conflict and punch them in the face kind of a person, right? Would that be?
Yeah, I am. Has gotten me in trouble before. I would say yeah, I'm a little bit of like, I think we should just fight and fight me. And I think we should just like get it out and get it over with. Like that is my MO. Like I think conflict makes me uncomfortable, but I think the route to being comfortable again is just to like do it and to fight through it and do that. And now this doesn't mean that I'm like a total jerk. Like I'm a pretty sensitive person. So probably after that happens, I will have to like cry about it or go talk to my therapist and process it. But I generally am like, if there is conflict or there's an elephant in the room, I'm just like, we're talking about that. We're doing it. We're talking about it. And I just think you need to fight sometimes.
I like that. So I like that distinction too, because sometimes we think that positive people are never want to do conflict, but there's still conflict. They still feel conflict. And then sometimes we feel like people who are willing to have the conflict are saying, no, 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 let's fight it out. They almost enjoy it. And it's saying what you just said is, no, I'm not enjoying it necessarily, but I just want to work it out. I just want to make this all happen. Right. So then we've also got Bethany with us here from our team. And Bethany is like Bethany, I always see you as like the peacemaker, mediator, like, let's be reasonable. Let's think about this. Do you like that? Would you agree with that in terms of your role?
Yeah.
And how do you see conflict playing that role?
Yeah, because I kind of think that like you don't have to get into an argument. Like if you disagree about something, it's just like, why don't we just have a conversation about it and like try to be really level-headed? And I might ask you questions and they might hurt a little bit, but I just have to ask the question to be able to have the conversation and vice versa. So it's like as much as possible, if we can remain like if we can not get defensive and come into a conversation and just like ask the questions we want to ask and then be able to talk about it, then that's what I want to do to try to find some kind of peace. Yeah, so I would definitely say I don't want to be like a peace what is it, like I don't want to be a peacekeeper, I want to be a peacemaker. And I think there's a difference between those two things.
Yeah, and say the difference between those two things. I think I like that language. I haven't heard us say that before. I really like that. What's the difference between the
Yeah.
peacekeeper and the peacemaker?
Well, I think a peacekeeper is somebody who like avoids conflict, like what we were kind of talking about, just to keep peace so that there's no arguments or conflict. Sorry, there's a baby in the background if you hear a baby squealing. But then I think a peacemaker is somebody who says, no, we have to address the conflict to create peace. So one avoids and one addresses, I think.
I like that language a lot. I think we'll have to keep using that. I don't think we've used that before. You can be a peacemaker or a peacekeeper, and those two things definitely work together. So let's start off by talking a little bit on this topic about, let's say you're at work and you disagree with somebody about something, and it's a significant disagreement. It's not one like, okay, well, I didn't like the type of cake you picked out for the party or the color of something or something. It's significant. It's a significant disagreement. First of all, how do you know whether you should bring it up or not? Because there's certain things I'm sure that somebody might just come in and you have a small disagreement on, and it's like, it's not worth bringing it up. How do you know if it's worth bringing it up or not?
I think in my family, we have a saying like, is this the hill you want to die on? Right. And so that always just comes into mind for me because that was said in my household a lot, and I come from a family of all girls where we were all very assertive. So that was a question we'd get asked when we would storm into the room really angry. My parents would be like, is this the hill you're going to die on today? Because like, you can die there if you want, but this is not going to be pleasant. And so I will sometimes like, again, because I'm more naturally assertive, I will still weigh it. Like, okay, is this something that like we are really opposed on and we can't move forward if we don't have like agreement in some way? Or like, does this not really matter? It might not be the way I would want to do it, or I don't really like it, but it still accomplishes our goal, works us toward the mission. And so a lot of those, like, I'll let pass by. And sometimes that's where you have to put your ego aside and be like, your way isn't always the right way, Stephanie, which is hard to hear. Even myself say it, but of like, sometimes you have to decide, like, is it worth fighting with somebody? And also knowing the person, right? Of like, if I argue with Bethany, I know we're going to come to that moment of peace. Like she's not going to let the conversation end in a bad place. And I really appreciate that about you, Bethany. But I have other people in my life that would like walk out and the conversation would leave in a really bad place, or they would shut down. And so I think like, I don't want to damage the relationship. If I don't think we can come to peace at the end, then it might not be worth fighting over it.
I like
Like,
that a lot.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm also super assertive and I'm a kind of like Philip, I gotta wait it out. I'm gonna take a beat. I'm gonna take a beater. And usually because guys, I'm not gonna lie, I think everything is important in my brain. It's all important and conflict is necessary. And like I'm one of those people that want to go and just like stand on that hill and die on that hill all the time. So I usually take a beat for like a week. Like it's a long, like I need to, if this thing is still bothering me a week later, that's when I'm going to bring it up. So yeah, I'm more of a wait it out, but I love, yeah.
I think that idea too of like, how is this a one-off, right? To your point, Diana, I probably have high standards all the time. And so if I addressed all the things in life that I thought didn't meet my standards or weren't going to be done the way I would have done it, I would nonstop talk to people all the time, like in a healthy and unhealthy way, right? It would just get to the point where it's like, stop it. No, like we got to move forward. And so for me, I think there's several things like the size and scope. If it's something that, to Stephanie's point, is this a hill you want to die on? I would die on the hill if the conflict comes from someone doing something that's totally against our mission or our values or our vision, right? You're like, no, that's actually the opposite of the alignment of what we're supposed to be doing. And if it's something that's ongoing, you're like, this happened last week and then again and now again. And so clearly it's not just that you had an off day. There's something deeper going on here, and this is really important. If you jumped in right away at the very first time you see any inkling of difference, I think that can get to be that can be hard to manage too. And then consistency is the last thing. My wife and I were talking recently about just like a different situation in our own circles about like, okay, like how could we go about addressing this with, a person and kind of just leaning in and talking with them. We were like, are we being consistent in our own standards of like how we treat all the people around us, not for any other reason than just like, are we being generously consistent? And so I think those are all measures that are helpful.
That's really good. We talked about different aspects of that. There's obviously some things that if somebody brought up that you should have conflict on, but we know that we don't. There was recently a Boeing plane where a panel flew off the side of the plane in mid-flight. And later it was discovered that there were bolts missing from that plane. As an engineer, and I've never put together airplanes, I know there are lots of procedures to prevent that from happening. Like it's literally like if there's bolts left over, there's supposed to be counts, there's supposed to be checks. I would guess that somewhere in that process, somebody saw something that was not right and didn't say anything about it. Somebody saw something that wasn't being done right and didn't say a word about it. We also work a lot like in healthcare space, and we know that a lot of errors that happen in hospitals are actually spotted by someone on the staff who doesn't say anything about it. So there's certain types of conflict that we would all agree, I think, listening to it to say is really important to be able to address. But then we also talked about there's maybe some that maybe we don't address. Only thing I would add to what you all said, which I think is really good, is that to me, if there's a conflict with somebody that's going to change the way I work with that person, potentially, or change my opinion of that person, then I like to try to bring it up. Like I want to try to dive into that a little bit more. Like if I'm so then I'm not assuming something about that person, especially if it's somebody I'm going to be working with for a long period of time. It's like, hey, could you explain that a little bit more? Can we dive into that a little bit more? Because I'm starting to create a story in my head, maybe that's not very good, and I want to understand more. And so sometimes I'll lean into conflict, even if it's a minor thing. Even if you come in the morning, I'll use a really simple example. You walk in the morning and you say good morning to somebody and they don't say good morning back to you and they just kind of walk past you. If it's really bothering you and it's out there, like it's not that big a deal. But if it's bothering you, and you sometimes can't you can't impact if it's bothering you or not. So if it's really bothering you, maybe you should go ask the question. I like one of the points I think we can make is it depends on the other person, right? Depends on how the other person reacts to conflict. Let's talk about that a little bit more. I think good teams are open to conflict with each other. They can be approachable. I think everybody would agree that as a person on a team, you want somebody to come and tell you something that's not going right. We've seen lots of surveys. Employees want to know when they're doing something wrong. Team members want to know when they're doing something wrong. Like we say that we want that, but sometimes some people act in ways that make it less likely for people to give that feedback than others. Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, how do people act? How could we react in a way that prevents people from telling us things that we need to know?
I mean, I think if you yourself are assertive back, right? If every time somebody tries to tell you something that's difficult or hard, you push back on them and don't receive well, I think that prevents people from saying things, right? Nobody wants to fight. Like that's not, I mean, I guess that's not true. Most people don't want to fight. Most people want conflict in a healthy way. And so if they come to you and they're like, hey, Diana, I noticed that I don't know, whatever. And I'm like, you're an idiot. Shut up. Don't tell me what to do. They're probably not going to bring me any more feedback.
Yeah, there's a comment. We just talked about this in another episode. Meeting people where they are. When somebody brings you something that's in conflict with you, you should meet them where they are, unless they're super, super angry with you and yelling at you or something like that. Then you don't need to yell back. You want to kind of steer them like, hey, I hear you. I understand you're really frustrated, but I'm trying to steer this back. But I've seen folks, obviously, like if I'm aggressive and you give feedback and say like, well, I don't care, this is what happened, da 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 da, and you get defensive about it or you get aggressive back, that's going to shut down things. I've also seen people get, I'll call it intense in that, where they suddenly, like the other person's like, hey, you didn't say good morning to me in this morning. And then somebody will suddenly lean in and say like, so yeah, I'm really sorry I didn't say good morning, but can you name 3 other times where I have insulted you? Like, isn't this the first time I've ever done this to you before? Like, isn't this? And it's you're like, whoa, never mind. I don't ever want to bring that up again. Has any I see you all nodding your heads. Have you seen that before?
Yeah, I mean, and I think maybe we should talk about this of like, how do you bring it up the right way then? Because I think what happens a lot of times, and because I mean, this has happened to me before, where somebody comes to you and basically tells you that something you did like hurt their feelings or upset them in some ways. And I think you have to first acknowledge like you're probably going to surprise this person, because if they knew they hurt your feelings, most healthy people would apologize to you, right? Once they recognized, I hurt your feelings. So it's like probably first understanding, like they probably don't know that yet. And so how you approach them with this is really important, because I think a lot of times people get surprised and then feel like they have to go on the defensive and they get really intense or say some of those things. So I don't know. I'd love to hear from everybody on our team, like what's the right way to bring it up, because I think we've all experienced it and then see it happen a lot in our work where people bring up something and really like when they tell us the story of how they did it, we're like, ooh, like I probably wouldn't have said that.
My first thought on this was try to know when it's a you problem versus a them problem. You know what I mean? Because I think sometimes it's like if somebody comes in, using Don's example, and doesn't say good morning to you, well, yeah, if that's the first time that's ever happened, like maybe just let it go. Like maybe it has nothing to do with you, like you might not need to even bring it up. Maybe you need to think about like, why does that bother me so much that they didn't say good morning to me? And maybe I need to just like deal with that and give them grace and like move on with the day. If it's a consistent thing, then I think maybe it's a conversation, but I think it's usually led by a question to say, instead of saying like, hey, what the heck is wrong with you? Why don't you ever say hi to me in the morning? I'm so nice to you. Instead just being like, hey, I've just noticed you seem like not yourself in the morning when you come into the office. Like, is everything going okay with you? And just kind of, I think to the point that Don was saying of like meeting people where they are, figuring out like what's going on with the other person versus like how it's impacted you is, I think, a good way to approach it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. Oh, sorry, Don. Too. I saw this online recently, so I can't claim it, but someone said if somebody ever approaches you like really aggressively with something and it feels out of the blue, like they were saying a great first question to ask is like, are you okay? Or when someone says something maybe off color or inappropriate to you, just to look at them and be like, are you okay? Because it's really disarming to ask that type of question and to approach somebody that way. Like, I loved how you framed that, Bethany, of like, hey, like, I just noticed you don't seem as peppy in the morning. Like, Philip, you're normally really positive and happy when you come in. And like this past week, it hasn't seemed that way. So, like, are you doing all right? And instead of like internalizing it, because, like, I'm a recovering people pleaser, and my brain immediately is like, well, we have to ask them and we have to figure it out, because if we did something wrong and we need to fix it and da 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 da. And like sometimes that's not it at all. They just need somebody to ask them like what's going on in their life and their world. And that is really impacting how they're showing up.
And I think what you guys are saying is also another key of like, start with a question, right? Don't just go like, hey, Don, I have some food back for you and you need to hear this. Like, start with a question, ask them how they are, get them talking about the situation to draw them in, so then you understand more fully and don't have to be on the like aggressive side of that and put them on the defensive side of that immediately.
For sure. And I think like make it a kind question. Like I can think of a boss I had once who like had gotten the advice you should ask questions to people before you bring something up, because they were a little bit brutal, and well, a lot of it brutal in their feedback. And so I can vividly remember one time something happened. I did not know I hurt someone's feelings, and they sat me down and they said, "Can you think of anything you've done wrong recently that might have upset your coworkers?"
Not a great
That's
question.
not a good question. That is not a good question. When I tell you I reacted poorly to that, it was bad.
Well, I had a leader one time, I messed up something, a shipping thing, and the leader came to me and said, "What were you thinking?" Technically that's a question, but I don't think she wanted my answer to that. So it was like not a great question. So you're right. A well-framed question.
Not like, who do you think you are? How dare you?
I like Stephanie, you know, your Instagram quote of the question of them, like, are you okay? And I think pairing that with what Bethany said, if you kind of just ask yourself first, also, like, am I okay? To Don's point, like, okay, someone didn't say good morning to you. Are you okay? Yes. And if you're fine, like, then you can approach a situation with far more calm. You know, the way Bethany preaches it, like the peacemaker approaches that idea of, like, let's have a conversation, right? If you're worked up and you have had an injustice done to you, that'll come across with the how dare you? Can you think of something you've done wrong? Which is different than like, hey, I want to talk to you about something that's important to me. And I think we have some questions for each other. I want to make sure we're on the same page. Like that's a very different thing. And if you're not okay, even if you've been unjustly treated or whatever it might be, or have a real cause to talk about, that'll come across. So am I okay? Are you okay? Let's be okay together. I always
Really
love.
like that, Philip.
Yeah, yeah. No, go for it.
Oh, I was just say I really like that of asking yourself that question first. That's a good, just simple prompt. And sometimes the answer might be like, no, I'm not okay. And I'm still going to bring it up because like, I know for myself, there are certain things that are, to use the, word triggers for me, right? Like different things have happened to me in my life or in work that sometimes make situations a little more sensitive for me. And so sometimes if I ask myself, are you okay? I'll say no. And then I'm like, okay, I still want to bring this up. But then I'm doing it not to confront that person, but with like vulnerability to help that person understand me better, to say, hey, I know that this is normal. And like maybe this is like totally normal. It's not on you. It is on me. Can I just share with you why that's hard for me? And like it's me sharing a little bit of my experience to help that person understand and work for me better. And for me, it's almost like conflict that helps us avoid conflict. Because if I bring it up, like it still might hurt that person's feelings a little bit because generally then they're probably going to feel bad that they did something and they didn't realize that that was going to be really hard for me or it was going to be a really triggering conversation for something. But again, I think it helps sometimes that if you answer, no, I'm not okay, it can be a trigger to say, no, you shouldn't have this conversation. Or maybe you should, but you're going to need to have a really vulnerable conversation with somebody.
So we're recognizing that if you feel some conflict with somebody, first of all, that you are flooded with feelings. But what we're saying is the best approach is to seek out the feelings of the other person. Is like, let's understand where the other person's at. What if the other person is your boss or is a manager or has some level of authority over you? Let's talk about that. What love that obviously adds some layers of complexity. But let's say your boss says something in a meeting and you disagree with them. Let's talk about something. Let's talk about the best approaches for that.
Type out a letter, sign it anonymous, roll it up in a bottle, and leave it in their office. I think that's a very safe and healthy approach.
Very smart.
Anonymous is key there. Anonymous.
Spell it correctly. It's hard to spell.
Yeah, and you've got to cut it out in clippings or type it so they can't tell it's your handwriting, right? Yeah.
People are listening right now going, really? Really? Okay. All right. We're going to go buy some magazines now and do some clipping.
No, we're all laughing. You just can't see us all laughing at the same time or hear us all laughing at the same time, but oh, don't do that.
So don't do that. So what is the approach? How can you bring it to a boss or a manager and it still be safe? Because there's an added layer of risk to that. If they get ticked off at you, a manager could look at you and say, like, you're not a team player and I'm going to push back.
Yeah, I think with the bosses scenario specifically, I think it depends on a couple of things. One, what are you disagreeing about, right? If the boss is saying, hey, we're installing this new process and you're the one that does the process and you're like, did you think about this thing, right? And disagree with that, I think that's a safe thing to disagree about, right? But if there's other things, right, and you're in a larger group setting, I think you should be cautious about the setting. You should be cautious about the relationship. You should be cautious about the actual thing that you're disagreeing on. It just adds a lot of layers of complexity to the actual conflict.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I was just going to expound on one of the things you said, which is like the setting. I think that's a really also Audrey's joined me. I forgot she's with me. So baby's looking at the ceiling now. Anyways, so one of the things you said was the setting. And I think that's true for like any conflict you're having. That's true of anybody, because I think you just have to be mindful of like how am I bringing something up to somebody in a respectful way to where it's not going to damage maybe their reputation in front of other people or make them feel uncomfortable. I think about this with, obviously we're using it in terms of like a boss, but I mean, thinking about it even in our personal relationships of, if I'm going to bring up something to my husband, it's probably better if I don't always bring that stuff up in front of our kids, or like other friends or family or things like that, of like knowing the right setting to bring up these conversations, I think is really, really important just for mutual respect and conflict. So I think that's a really good one.
Yeah, you're talking about safety here overall. So how can you make it safe? And you often think of it like, how do I make it safe for my manager or my boss? Because you think, well, they have authority, but safety, sometimes that means I'm not going to embarrass you, right? If there's something that they're obviously wrong about, and if everybody knows it's wrong, sometimes it's good. It depends on your team. It depends a lot. You have to recognize your situation. But if your boss if you're really open, I think our team has no trouble calling out mistakes on our meetings. At least you guys, I feel like you guys do it all the time. You guys are very quick to point out all of my flaws and all of Diana's flaws on our team, which is great. I love
You're
it.
less quick to point out mine. I feel like you go to a podcast and have a whole podcast about it to talk to me about things. But it's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
I code the stories about Diane. Yeah. I heard this person named Diane who we work with a long time ago.
Don's easier to agree with. That's 100% true.
So then, I mean, it's the flip side too. So if you're a manager, you probably the right moment, you probably say, I want people to disagree with me. I want people to tell me when I'm wrong. So what can managers do to help create the safe environment where people can bring them things back when they know that something's wrong?
I mean, I think you just said it kind of, Don, and framed it really well. And that's, I think, you've done with us. Like, I want you to tell me. And you've been very like clear and open with all of us that like you want the feedback. You want the feedback in the moment. You're comfortable with it being somewhat direct, right? Like we all know, like, don't be brutal, right? But like if something's wrong, like it's very safe and comfortable on our team in the middle of a meeting, be like, hey, like I don't think that number is right. I think we need to look at that more. I don't know that you pulled the right research for that, right? That we do that because you've told us we can. And I think so much of that is permission based, that managers oftentimes do not ever tell their teams, you can give me feedback, or I want feedback from you. Or if you see something that is wrong, I want you to say it and bring it to me, even if I would be the one at fault. And I think that's why people get really afraid, because they'll usually only see the reaction to something and then freak out. Like, oh, if I bring them something, then that's going to happen to me too. I'm going to get in trouble for whatever it is. But I think it's you saying, yes, you can bring this to me. And then I know you're very intentional, because I know there are times we tell you things you don't like, or you would have preferred us not to say it to you, right? But you stay very calm too, where like we might have a longer conversation about it later or process it later, but we try not to embarrass you and you try not to embarrass us.
Yeah, that's an important moment there. And I think leaders can be just vulnerable too. If leaders are showing where they know that they've messed up and they're admitting it too, then I think it makes it more okay for others to bring it up too.
Yeah, I was thinking of a time. This year I would consider a massive timeline mistake. I guess that was the end of last year. And I found out and I was like, this is terrible. And I reached out to Diana and she just leaned in and helped. Like it was a really meaningful experience, a timeline for a pathfinder and a strategic plan, like some reports that we were doing. So I was not aligned with our client the way I thought I was. And it worked out. We're good. The relationship's good. We did it all on time still. We got it done. But both like in how you both as leaders receive, I think you also share that same level of, to Stephanie's point, And I think it's that really crucial question, like mistakes do not mean that you're a terrible human being and that you're going to like disappear. And I think that's the culture where whether it's a leader that you're talking to or someone who's a colleague next to you or someone on your team that reports to you, like a mistake doesn't necessarily mean you're a terrible person. And then that leads to conflict. And so the other part of conflict I thought we haven't touched on either, but we're talking as if all conflict is planned. Like I think of that because I'll plan it out because I tend to avoid it, right? But sometimes conflict is not planned. Sometimes, to Diana's point, it just pops up in the middle of a meeting. You realize, wow, this is a topic we've not talked about, but I really strongly disagree with what everyone is saying or what my leader is saying. And so I think that's another element to it too. Sometimes it catches you off guard.
Yeah, I mean, or sometimes you just wake up and, choose violence to say that term, not in a horrible way, but like, I don't know if any of you who are more assertive people, sometimes you just wake up and there is just like a day where you're like, I'm ready. And I'm ready for somebody to disagree with me today because I am in a sour mood and I'm ready for it. And maybe Philip never feels this way because he is high positivity and I'm low positivity and harmony. But I think to your point, Philip, I thought that was so interesting that you brought that up because how you just described you process it. I don't know that I've ever thought about it that way, of that you plan your conflict. I think for me, I just take things as they come and happen. So maybe all of mine is spontaneous.
Yeah. It's an interesting concept, right? You can plan your conflict. You also have to be careful that you're not creating your own conflict. I know, like, when I'm very strategic, and I know earlier in my career, I actually can still do this very much, is I'm always thinking, like, driving into a meeting or something like that, I'm thinking about what I think is going to happen. And sometimes I can play it out in my head and say, like, oh, we're gonna show up to this meeting and such is going to speak up and they're going to push back and and it's going to potentially sideline the meeting. And then you go into it, and then that person shows just a slight inkling that I was right, just a little bit. And then, like, early in my career, I just pounce on them. Like, I know what you're going to say. I'm going to and then you jump on that person. And one of the best ways to really make conflict go the wrong direction is what we've done whole episodes on this, is to presume someone's intentions. So the idea of that is to say, I know what you're thinking. Psychologically, if we're in a conflict and I tell you what you're thinking, that the other person shuts down. Like, it's immediately, now we go back to the emotional side of our brain. We were going to fight. Now we're fighting. It's, I know why you did that. I know what you're thinking about. I know you brought this up. And a lot of conflict that seems to come spur of the moment actually probably comes from that. It's the person actually building up feelings over time, starting to create a story about the other person. That person's a villain. I'm waiting till they show up. We use that example. We've talked about heroes and villains before, of like, if you're Batman and the Joker comes to your house and tries to give you cookies that they fresh baked, Batman's still looking at them going, like, what are you up to? You're up to something. I don't know what it is. It doesn't matter what the actions are if the person really is a villain. And the truth is, very few of us actually work with villains. But let's pivot on this a little bit, this discussion, because so far all the things we're talking about are like really healthy in terms of how we approach things. But what if the other person doesn't react well? What if you do it exactly right and you bring something, let's say you bring something to your boss and your boss yells at you, or you bring something to a coworker and your coworker flies off the handle? What happens if the other person doesn't do the right thing?
Well, I was thinking about this a little bit because I was thinking, even when we talk about like the way that I tend to approach conflict is like, I do want to solve the problem and I do want to get to peace, but sometimes whenever I've done that, depending on the person, sometimes the other person may not, they might, to maybe to Stephanie's language earlier, they might not want to fight me. And I'm like, but I really want to solve this thing right now. And they're like retreating. And it's like, no. And I want to, and so sometimes I can want to push and keep trying to like pursue the conversation when they're clearly not ready to have that conversation for whatever reason. And that's something that like I can't control and is difficult sometimes. And so I have to make a decision in that moment to either decide, like, is it worth it to keep pursuing it, which we kind of talked about earlier? Is it worth it to keep pursuing it? Or can we just not have a productive conversation right now? And do we need to like come back to it later and find another time to bring it up, or to just tell them like, hey, I really want to talk about this, but like, when's a better time to talk about it because you don't seem ready to? And you know what? Their answer might be like, never, thanks, which is really difficult. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge that I can't say that I fully mastered. But is there. Yeah.
It's a really hard thing to do if the other person's, especially in a state of rage. I like your point there. Like we often say, don't fight angry. Because if you're angry, you don't think very clearly. You don't tend to do the right things. Your brain's trying to hurt the other person, not help the other person. So taking a timeout is a really good play for sure.
Yeah, I think the pause is powerful. Like, and just even saying sometimes like calling it that, like, hey, like we're gonna stop for now. We're gonna pause for today. I know we've got a lot more probably to discuss here. It seems like we've uncovered some things, and wounds, but I think the power of saying like you don't have to see it through all the way to the end in one setting. And sometimes, frankly, like that is impossible. And I think like I have seen myself make that mistake at like, younger points in my career, or I can think like when I was in college and I was very like gung ho, we're going to change the world and like get out of my way. And it's sometimes you can't actually accomplish the whole thing. You can't resolve the conflict in one setting or one meeting, no matter how late you stay up, or how long you go. And so I think it's really important to put a pause when we either recognize, okay, yeah, we've gotten to the point where our brains are just trying to hurt each other now and win versus actually find a solution. Or maybe you tap on something that turns into a much bigger topic. Like you thought you were just bringing up one small issue, and then your boss is like, no, you're talking about the entire future of the company, right? And so it may not be something that you get to resolve in one conversation, and knowing when to pause and that it's okay to pause, and that doesn't mean that this has just become now a passive aggressive topic. Because I think that's the other people make when you take a pause, is then you start treating each other differently during the pause. And it's just like, as much as you can, just respect what it is. It just means we're going to continue this conversation later, not just that we're both going to remain mad at each other for like a week.
Yeah. So sometimes it's just sit there and take the punches for a minute and let the other person just get it out and then say, okay, let's come back and talk about this more. Thanks for bringing that up. Sometimes it's you got to meet the other person where they are a little bit and say like, what do we both care about? Like, what do we both want? What do we both want as an outcome for this to try to solve the problem? But I want to bring up something that I think all of us have heard in different coaching. So we do a lot where we are working. It's funny. People sometimes ask as we do the podcast, like, do you guys do this for real? Like, is this really your day job? Yeah. The podcast is like a side thing for all of us. Like most of our day is spent working with real teams, real managers, real people. And a lot of times they're in conflict. It could be an employee in conflict with a manager with an employee, two employees with each other, two managers with each other. All those different things come up. But one of the most common things that I hear from somebody when we're coaching and talking about the conflict is they will say, yeah, but they, and those are the words, yeah, but they didn't do it right. They aren't bringing this out. They aren't doing this. And the advice that I try to give is, but stay the high ground. You can only control what you do. Keep the high ground. Like if you can keep yourself from getting angry, if you can keep yourself asking questions, if you can keep yourself showing empathy, if you can keep trying to make it a safe place, even if the other person never does it the right way, you may not resolve that conflict. It still puts you in the best of positions. Let's talk about like, I was coaching somebody recently who has a manager who just does not conflict well, is not even trying to create a safe space. And we don't have access to that manager. So like, we can't even help that person with it. It's somebody from the outside. And I gave that person advice, and they said, well, but my manager keeps coming back and they'll yell at me if I bring something up, and they'll do this and they'll do this. And I'm like, I keep saying, keep the high ground and keep coming back calmly, keep asking questions, keep trying to find common space, and go look for a new job. Because here's the thing, even if you have to end up leaving that job, if you left it and you kept the high ground, what are your coworkers going to say about you? What kind of results are you going to drive? It's going to be positive. Like all of those things help you in the long term, even if you can't resolve that conflict. If you're a manager and you have an employee who just keeps coming at you, it's tempting. I know you may want to swing back and go join the person and take the low ground. But if you keep the high ground, even if you end up having to terminate that employee, that person, sometimes I've seen that. And I think everybody here's probably seen the scenario where the employee comes back and says, okay, I was treated fairly there. At the end of the day, I got really upset. I didn't see something. Or even the coworker, like if you keep the high ground, eventually, even if the other person never does come to the table, it's still better for you and that team to hold that. So it's also think about what you do. You can't, two wrongs don't make a right, right? So if the other person is doing it wrong, you can't say, yeah, but they did this, so now they started calling me names. Don't start calling them names back, right? That's just joining them down in the hole. That's not good.
Yeah. And I love how you said that they use the they language, right? They say things like they do this, they do that. And when I know I'm going into conflict and doing that sort of stuff, I try to make sure that I use we language and remind myself, if no one else, that we're on the same team. I want a resolve. I want a result, right? We're on the same team. We're friends, we're coworkers, whatever it is. We're in this together. And there's a reason that I want to have the conflict. There's a reason I want to resolve the conflict. It's good intentions and we're in this together.
Yeah. And I was going to add to that. I mean, I'm glad you said that, Diana, because I was thinking that too, is like one of the most, I mean, yeah, where somebody has said that to me before, like whenever we're like about to start some conflict, like it's like right on the edge. And somebody literally said to me, we're on the same team. Hey, we're on the same team. And it was like, it just kind of like snapped me out of it for a minute to be like, oh, yeah, you're right. We are on the same team. Like we're working towards the same goal. We're not against each other. Like we're supposed to be on the same path. So I think it's powerful to even just say those words to the other person sometimes.
Yeah, it's not even a way to necessarily resolve the conflict. A lot of times we think that trust resolves conflict, but it's actually the other way around. Conflict creates trust. If you have somebody that you've never disagreed with and you've worked together, you probably haven't worked together very long, and you probably aren't in a very deep relationship, and you haven't probably worked really closely with them. Like you really haven't gone to battle with somebody. If you've gone to battle with somebody, you've really worked closely with them and you've disagreed with each other, and you've been able to bring those things out, especially if it was emotional for both of you, and especially if it went south for a little bit and you brought it back. Those are the people that that you get along with really well. Like I always think, Diana, that trip that we took there was pretty early in our work relationship. And I think it was good from a standpoint of that, because we knew that we came out of that and it was still okay. Like we still drove, we had a long drive back to the office after that and everything else. And I don't think at least I wasn't ticked off at you for a long time. Maybe you were ticked off. Maybe you're still not over it.
I mean, I'm clearly still not over it. I brought it up 9 years later. No, I'm kidding. No, I do feel like we were able to because you were like, what is your deal? Why can't you just do? And I was like, I don't think you understand. I'm terrible at directions. You should trust Siri more than you trust me. Like it's just like really just don't. And so I mean, we kind of joked about it, and it was still a deep conflict for both of us because you were like, you're the co-pilot. And I was like, that's not happening. And so, but we never got mad at each other really. I mean, I think we were both frustrated with the situation, but we never treated each other like we didn't care. We never moved there. And so I think it was good that we realized like we can have conflict, we can disagree about how something should be done and still treat each other well.
Yeah. If Matt was on, he would bring up the Diana's legendary sense of direction when you two traveled together and you walked out of the hotel for 3 days in a row and turned left to go to the walk to the office. And on the fourth day, Diana walks out and leads the way and turns right. And Matt's like, where are you going? We've done this 3 days in a row where we went, it's that way. It's that way. And Diana, oh, okay.
I have no cognitive map. Please
Yeah.
do not follow me. It's bad.
So it is truly understanding each other. The conflict helps us to understand where each other's coming from and understands maybe where some of our strengths and weaknesses really are. So that does help us to work better together long term. So not only do we not want to avoid conflict, we don't want to just be the peacekeeper, right? So that don't bring conflict to that. Because I've had that. I've heard people say in my career, like, I want this team just to get along. Do not want any conflict on this team. And those teams that I've been on like that are very fake. They can't disagree with each other. There's things that they know that doesn't work. It's those projects that at the end where you go around the room and say, does anybody think this is going to work? And everybody's like, no, I really don't. Well, why didn't anybody say anything? It's not really my place. It's the too nice. It's the church council syndrome thing that we hear a lot, right? It's the group that's like, we have to sit together and we want to be nice to each other. So even if you have a terrible idea, I'm not really going to shoot it down. I'm going to just build on it and say, oh, maybe we could do that. That sounds like an interesting idea. that's not really a team. That's just a group of people trying to be nice with each other. And you take that stuff home with you anyway. So I think
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead,
Sorry,
Stephanie.
just to add one point to that of we'll say a lot when we do like different like team dynamic workshops and communication workshops with people that a team where everybody thinks exactly the same way has a lot of harmony and there's a lot of peacekeeping, but they probably accomplish less, right? Because everybody's looking at things the same way. Nobody's willing to disagree or look at it. But if you have a team that has a lot of different personalities and perspectives, they probably have more conflict naturally, but they also naturally accomplish more. And so I think when we say that sometimes with our clients, it helps reframe conflict for them of like, sometimes conflict is the way to get to like accomplishing something more or innovating on a new idea. And we may not all agree on the how or the what, or even the why sometimes, but at least we talked about it. At least we figured out, like, is that the way we want to go versus like what Don was saying, where it's like the church council, where like, no one's really going to disagree, but then we're all going to do things that we know really aren't going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And to add to that, I mean, another thing you probably heard us say on the podcast a lot is that good communication only happens when you know you might be wrong. And I think that that's a huge part of this conversation too. And we talked about it a little bit of just the vulnerability in these conversations. And so I think that's a huge one, is just if you can come in, and we usually always think we're right, but if we can come in and just say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something, help me understand where you're coming from on the other side of things too.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, teaming is hard. Like working with each other is hard. That's why we talk about the whole people-centric thing. We are complex beasts and we don't always think rationally about things, and especially when we feel threatened. And so work to make sure that we don't feel threatened when working with others, like seek other people's input. Don't be threatening when someone approaches you. And let's embrace that conflict. Let's figure out how to conflict together, because if you can do that, then you can build a really strong team that works together. So this is a great episode. Thanks everybody here for participating. And if you have any ideas, please shoot them our way. We'd love to hear from you. But thank you so much for joining us on the People Centric Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the People Centered Podcast. We are so grateful for you joining us every week. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. Also, feel free to share on your social media with everyone that you know. It really does help us. If you would like to contact us, I have put our information in the show notes. Please reach out anytime. We love hearing from you. We will be back next week with a new topic. Until then, be well and lead well.